Judges 19:29. So the Levite had put his concubine on the donkey. He takes her home, and then it just says this with no explanation of anything. When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine, limb by limb, into 12 parts. Now, right there, why 12? What's the symbolism? She's Israel, and she's being torn apart into 12 different parts. Well, how many tribes are there? 12 tribes, right? And then it says this, and he sent them to all the areas in Israel. Next, and this is number 4, because this is a literary technique where the author's going to tell us something about what's going on. How do we recognize that there's been a big shift from the first part of the story to the last? And the way that we do it is through the idea of where the enemy is. So in the first 6 cycles, or I'll even show you the very first sentence of the book, the enemy is always on the outside. You have Israel, the 12 tribes, and it's one of their neighbors is the enemy. And what happens when you get to the end of the book? Where's the enemy? It's on the inside. The enemy is no longer outside. It's now we're fighting each other. That's the horror of a civil war, how it tears apart the nation. So there's a literary technique, and I just want to show you this because this describes very well what's happening to the text. So here's what you can do. If you want to turn to Judges 1:1, look at the very first sentence of the book. So I'll show you Judges 1:1, and then we're going to flip real quick over to Judges 20, because that's the Civil War, the start of the Civil War. So Judges 1:1 begins with an inquiry to God. Israel inquiring of God. So we see the author tells us after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord. They're going up to God with a question. What's their question? Who of us is to go first to fight against the Canaanites? So who's the enemy in this case? The Canaanites. It's those people out there. It's the other. One thing that we pay attention to when you're looking for literary techniques like repetition is you're going to find the very same sentence show up at the Civil War time, but now the enemy changes. So that's verse 1. Who of us is to go up first to fight? Who are they fighting? The Canaanites. Now, do this. Turn to Judges 20, verse 18. And notice who they're going to go fight against. The same exact thing is happening, right? The Israelites went up to Bethel, the house of God, or the city where the ark is, and they inquired of God. What's their question? Who of us is to go up first to fight against? And now it's our brother, the Benjamites. So you can see, as society declines, you lose God, everything goes into disorder, and suddenly the enemy is now each other instead of something that unifies us from the outside. And of course, that's how civil wars happen, is you're infighting, and it's brother versus brother, and it's a terrible place to be for a country as you're being literally torn into pieces because of of what's happening. So that's just another technique of literary, how you can match what's going on in the text. And these are so common that there's hundreds of them in the book of Judges. No time to do it, but I just wanted to show you that one because there's a big shift in who the enemy is, and we need to pick that up. Now, of course, they go into a civil war. Eventually, the nation is going to reconstitute, and the story goes on to Ruth and then Samuel, and Samuel is the introduction to the monarchy. First, Saul, and this is what's interesting about Judges. The first king is Saul. He's from a town called Gibeah, and Gibeah is the town in Judges 19 that has the major offense. The major offense is committed against a guy whose father-in-law is from Bethlehem in Judea. Well, where's David from? Bethlehem and Judea. So there's symbolism at least going on where God's connecting these, because even those kings were going at each other. So hopefully you see that. I think that one stands out. Now, flip your page. I'm going to completely shift gears. And I'm going to deal with one thing in Judges 19 it's a disturbing little sentence, but I want to show you some things from the perspective, a more symbolic perspective. So we're generally not taught in church to read our Bible this way, to look for the symbols. Very much like if you said, Jesus is the sacrifice, he's the Passover lamb. So you get a symbolic picture of his death. He dies on Passover. He's called the Lamb of God, just like the original Passover lamb. The blood covers you and you're delivered from slavery. Jesus has the same function. He is the Passover lamb, but it's symbolic. So there's almost always in the Bible, there's something symbolic going on. Or as we always talk about, cultural. So as we read our Bible, generally speaking, most of us read at the surface level. We kind of see the words. We're not really doing a lot of trying to pull out all the symbols. When you go to scholarly work, they're pulling out all the symbols, particularly people who are trained and to do that. And it's amazing what you can eventually see. So you have this narrative text. We read right at the surface, nothing wrong with that, but it can almost get boring or tedious, or we're a little confused. We don't catch the message. And if we don't allow ourselves to kind of go deeper into the text, and instead of reading at the surface, you start looking for the symbols of the text, and they kind of rise up. They emerge out of the Bible. And it's really cool when one day you read something and you're like, oh, I see symbolically what they're talking about, rather than just the surface level reading. So in the Eastern culture, especially the ancient Near East, this is how they communicate, very symbolically. God communicates symbolically to people. He communicates to the culture that he needs to communicate with. We're also very visual people. We love symbols, and symbols hit us very hard in our humanity. We hang on to them. They mean a lot to us. So if you haven't considered that before, this is what I'm going to take you through, is a couple of the symbolic things that are going on in the story of Judges 19. Okay, so unfortunately, since we've already compared Judges 19 to Sodom and Gomorrah, what happens in Judges 19 is there's a Levite. Now, of course, the Levites are the priests, and he has a second wife, a concubine. They go down to Bethlehem. They're with her father-in-law, and they're coming out of Bethlehem and back north, and they're traveling through the tribal area of Benjamin, and there's rape and a sexual violence. So I apologize. I apologize for the language, but that's what's happening in the text, just like in Sodom and Gomorrah. And what scholars have noticed is that very often when we find a story of, I won't say all of them, if you want to say the majority of them, when you find a story in the Bible or in other ancient cultures of rape or sexual violence, it's almost always telling us that society is disintegrating. The stories are always connected to something that's disintegrating right next to the very next story will be the disintegration of the fabric of society. So that's just symbolically. Yes, these things happen, but then you have symbolically societal disintegration. For instance, Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. So rape, sexual violence, societal disintegration, at least in symbol. And that's what's happening in Judges 19. A couple other ones, if we want to add another piece to this, you can have sexual violence, like a rape or threat of a rape. That's indicative of the breakdown of the social fabric. That's not supposed to happen. And then very often it leads to war. Well, that's what's happening in Judges. So you have a symbolic story of, it's a story that happened, but then you can take the symbols of sexual violence and the breakdown of society, and all of a sudden you're at war. And this happens in other places of the Bible. So we see the pattern, not only in biblically, but you'll find it in other stories from the ancient Near East. So, for instance, one of them is Dinah in Genesis. So Dinah and the Canaanites. Dinah is raped, and that's then followed by a war. Her brothers go and attack the Canaanites. So there's another example. The breaking down of the fabric of neighboring people. And then the final one that I put on your handout is in 2 Samuel, Tamar. And this is within David's family. So there's a rape, and then immediately following that, you get one brother killing another brother, then you get the fabric of David's family just falls apart. So again, it's just that scholars notice there tends to be a theme of symbolically that those go together. So I just wanted to point that out because it's another thing that we don't connect them together, but they should probably be connected together. Okay, so Judges 19 is probably, it's a tragic story. It's disturbing. And again, what happens is the Levite, and of course the Levite is supposed to be the religious leader, his wife goes down into Bethlehem. So here's one thing we can contrast. They go down to Bethlehem. Hospitality galore. The hospitality's over the top. The father-in-law is pulling out all the stops, food, drink, sharing, everything. Tons of hospitality. Then we contrast that as they're moving back north and they go up to the town of Gibeah. Horrible, inhospitable actions. It's the same thing as Sodom and Gomorrah. You have chapter 18 of Genesis was Abraham. He hosted the angels that showed up at his tent, even though he had just been circumcised. And he's showing all the hospitality. Next story, Sodom and Gomorrah. So they're placed right next to each other to give you a contrasting of hospitality. So you go from one element of hospitality down to the second element of hospitality, and then you find, of course, it's almost the same exact rape story coming out of Sodom and Gomorrah. But there's one piece that gets added to this that you just don't even know what to do with. You're just like, what is happening? So they give the woman over to all the men of the town. There's violence against the woman. And the very next day then, as the text tells us, the Levite walks out the door. The woman has died. She's on the threshold of the door and she's died. It's just this terrible sentence. The Levite says, come on, get up. She doesn't move. He puts her on his donkey, takes her back to town, and then dismembers her body. Now, I know you think, what is going on here? But I want to show you something because the very first time I read it, I thought, oh, I can't believe what's happening. I want to show you this is a symbolic event. He knows the symbol of what he's doing. The people of Israel know the symbol of what he did, and nobody is concerned about the symbol of dismemberment. They're upset about what happened to her at Gibeah, the sexual violence. And if we miss that this dismemberment is actually a symbolic event, and it's symbolic to what's happening to Israel. What happens to a country in a civil war? We would use language like the country's being torn apart. The fabric of society is being torn apart. Well, they're Easterners. He doesn't say a word. He does something. He does something concrete. So what I want to show you is nobody questions his actions. They all know exactly what the symbol means, and that's the whole point. So it's a symbolic dismemberment. The female body is like a stand-in for society. What's happening to society? It's being ripped apart. So it's a sign of Israel, and that female is a representative of the social body of Israel. Again, because if you think about what's happening, think about our civil war that we had in America. It tore families apart, tore the country apart. If we were to describe this, we would say Lady Liberty was torn into pieces, and 50 pieces were sent to all the states. That would be the symbolic nature of what we might say. So this whole thing is very symbolic to what's going on, and they know it. And so this is what I want to show you, because if you read that sentence, you think, what is happening to this? So I want you to go to the text. It's Judges 19, 29 and 30. And then I'm going to show you culturally, how would they know that this is a sign? Where do they get the idea? Nobody's upset by the dismemberment. They know exactly what it means. And how do they know that? Well, there's some collective thinking about this, and it comes from the culture of the ancient Near East. So Judges 19, 29. So the Levite had put his concubine on the donkey. He takes her home, and then it just says this with no explanation of anything. When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine, limb by limb, into 12 parts. Now, right there, why 12? What's the symbolism? She's Israel, and she's being torn apart into 12 different parts. Well, how many tribes are there? 12 tribes, right? And then it says this, and he sent them to all the areas in Israel. So he's going to send couriers with the message of what happened, but to all the tribal areas of Israel. But when they get it, they're not upset about the dismemberment. They're upset about the message of why this happened. So verse 30, everyone who saw it was saying to one another, such a thing has never been seen or done. Now, what's the thing? And see, the very first time I read this, I thought the thing was the dismemberment. I thought that's what they're all upset about. But it's actually not, because in the next chapter, he explains, look, the reason I cut her up and sent the pieces out was because of what happened in Gibeah. And everyone's like, okay, got it. There's nothing, and that's just, that to us is as strange as can be, but as such a thing that hasn't happened is not the Levites' actions, it's the actions of the Gibeonites. So then it says, just imagine, we must do something, right? So they see the dismembered body and they know the sign. We're being torn apart. Now we have to go do something about it, because they hear the story of the female. Okay, then what I want to deal with is this sentence right here. He sent them to all the areas of Israel. Why do that? So what does a dismembered body and all the tribes of Israel have to do with anything about the decline of a nation? And where we get it is another cultural piece from the ancient Near East. And so now I'm about to depart everything you've heard biblically. We're going to go down to Egypt and check out something in Egypt. But you have to remember, the Israelites recently came out of Egypt. Egypt is their giant next door neighbor, the empire right next door. They know all about Egypt. They all know all about Egypt and the way they describe things. And so scholars have pointed out that you can say, what's the symbolic nature of this? Well, we have to take a trip down to Egypt and to a story that they tell, the Egyptians tell, about these gods. And it's a very old story. It goes back to like the 3,000, so 3,000 years old. Or no, it would be about 5,000 years old now. It's a myth. It's obviously not real. But what they're doing is examining the decline of societies. Why does Egypt rise and then fall? Well, what's the book of Judges about? Israel rising and falling. And so this whole myth is about the rise and fall of the dynasties in Egypt. Why do they suddenly collapse and go into chaos? Only to rise out of the chaos and go back into some kind of order. So that's what they're trying to describe. Now they do it using gods. Osiris, Seth, or Set, some people say, and Horus. So let me just tell you, I'm taking a huge story and dissolving it down in just a couple minutes, but I just want to show you that there's something from the culture that all those people would probably know, and that the reason the dismemberment makes sense is because they know this story. So there's a god, this is obviously Egyptian myth, one of their gods named Osiris. He's a benevolent king. He represents good, order, vegetation, fertility, the Nile. The Nile brings life every year. He has an evil twin brother named Set. Set is the opposite. He's desert, storm, disorder, violence, chaos. And what happens is that Set, the evil brother, is jealous of the king. And the story goes that at some point, Set gets so jealous that he murders Osiris. There's a festival in Egypt that they have this celebration every year that they reenact this. And then here's what happens. Set dismembers the body. And you have to remember, they're thinking about, why is our society collapsing? Well, the social body is being torn apart. Egypt is fracturing. And the body of Osiris represents the fracturing of the nation. So Set dismembers the body, and then he distributes it to the 42 provinces in Egypt. Some stories say 16. Some stories say 42. But what's the point? Well, the whole country of Egypt has been fractured. There's now, war going on, whatever, and we need to reconstitute the body to bring the nation back to life. And what happens? There's a goddess named Isis. She's a magician. She's able to step in, bring all the pieces back together, and from that, they create a son named Horus, who ends up being the new king, who then brings Egypt back around. It's a cycle of decline and then bringing back to order. So in biblical studies, you see something very strange, a sentence like in Judges about this dismemberment, but you find something very similar in the culture right next door. So when the Levite does this, he knows what he's doing symbolically. He knows what he's telling his neighbors because they kind of all know the story, or at least they know the symbolism of it. Because eventually, what's going to happen to Israel, right? You have that imagery, dismembers the body, 42 provinces, and then it becomes that sign for Israel. And then the social body will eventually come back together in a cohesive manner. So it sounds like a strange thing. I was very disturbed the first time I read it, and I had to do a lot of research on it. But it seems that there's at least something in the culture that everybody would understand is going on. So, okay, I know I'm running a little bit past our time here. I hope that at least helps. You get this. I was always bothered by that sentence because it sounded like what a horrible person the Levite is. But the people don't react to that. They know the sign. And then once it was like, oh, there's actually symbolism going on beyond the story. So it's the social body or the body politic of a country. And that's what that represents. And I think the Levite knows that, and the Israelites know that. Okay, hopefully that'll at least help with that little text right there. So quick review. Judges, if you get anything, it's the decline of Israel. But it's not the decline of just Israel. We can see these cycles happening in other countries as well, as the culture changes and they lose their order. You have the disintegration of religious cults. That we see all over the world. And then the social fabric being torn apart after that, as the countries starting to divide, that ultimately leads into some kind of civil war. One of the main ideas that we have to remember about this is, what's the author telling us is the cause of this? They forget God and they do evil in the eyes of the Lord. So what's our individual responsibility? Not only individually, but then as corporately when we get together to worship, right? Is to make sure that we do our part to not forget God, to keep our eye on God, to corporately worship, to keep the body sustained together, even if there's infighting going on. So everybody has their part to do. Okay. So Judges, it takes some work. You have to be real familiar with the text, and that takes work. You have to read it over and over and over. It does help to search for some symbols. And, the more we can see this 3,000-year-old book that tells us something even about probably our societies today makes it still relevant, which is the whole point of me wanting to go through this, because if you don't see those symbols, you just avoid the book of Judges, because it's like, I don't know who these names are or where they're going. It doesn't mean anything to me. And then you're like, oh, wait a minute. This kind of does mean something to us.